First of all, how do you define democracy? Because we know for the past many years it's been defined by the Western world. So, what's your definition of democracy?
Well, the very term democracy is used everywhere, yet its definition is controversial. If you ask a typical, say, guy in the West, he's likely to say, well, it's a multi-party system. It's a one person, one vote, universal suffrage. I would describe this kind of definition as procedural democracy. The Chinese one is more sophisticated. We would call our democracy as people's democracy. Or today we even see whole process people's democracy, which will be a combination of not only procedural democracy, but also substantive democracy. This matter of substance is important. That is, what kind of purpose democracy should serve and what kind of objectives democracy should achieve. So this is where China, I think, excels. The Chinese model excels.
You just mentioned like China's whole process, people's democracy. Could you elaborate more on that?
Yeah, it means, again, let's compare the Chinese model and the Western model of democracy. I described already the Western model is essentially procedural democracy. Or as a French thinker, Rousseau, hundreds of years ago, described the Westminster democracy, British style, as one-day democracy. That is by time of election. Once you have an election every 4 years, on that particular day of election, you have democracy. After that, you don't have democracy. So the Chinese, what we call is a whole process democracy, in contrast to Western, what I call limited process of democracy. That's the key difference. I can give you some examples. For instance, what we call the democratic lawmaking, how to make a legislation. In the case of China, when we promulgate a law or an act, in the first place, we will send this very first draft of this act or this law to the grassroots. We have hundreds of, or even more, depending on your definition, what we call the legislative reach out offices. For instance, in Shanghai, there is several of this kind of offices. You will send this draft to these offices, and this outreach offices will contact ordinary people to have their feedback, their reactions. I'll give you an example. When China adopted its law against family violence, and the first draft came to the Shanghai office, and they present this to the ordinary people. They received all kinds of feedbacks. One feedback, which was in the end incorporated into this very particular law, is that in the original text, there was only reference to husband violence against wives. Then in the new law, there is this the violence by the young against the elderly. That also occurred in many circumstances. So this new element, which was brought into the law. In other words, in the very process, from the very beginning of the lawmaking, you have really involvement of the people. Then you have the discussion by the professional legislators, and then adopted by the National People's Congress. And they also have the supervision of this law, to what extent it has been implemented. They have all kinds of mechanisms to supervise and to see whether this law has been implemented. And it also can be revised according to the changing situations. Same with what we call the democratic decision-making. In the case of China, we all talk about the rise of China. It had to do with China's long-term planning. We have a 5-year plan. Every 5 years, we have a major plan for economic social development. This very process of this 5-year plan, and it's very making, again, from the very beginning to the middle, to the very end, and to its implementation, to its supervision. You have a whole process. For instance, normally it takes at least 1.5 years to draft this 5-year plan. It involves thousands of rounds of all kinds of consultation with different think tanks, ordinary people, internet democracy, solicit opinion from the people, and at various levels of People's Congress. In the end, you reach consensus, then to be adopted at the National People's Congress. Then every what we call two sessions, the session of People's Congress, the session of the Political Consultative Conference, the Chinese leaders will report to the deputies to what extent we implemented this 5-year plan and also national 1-year plan and even longer plans.
Mm-hmm.
It's already a very sophisticated process. Same with the election of leaders, the what called democratic process of choosing leaders. If the Western model is called the election, the Chinese model would be called selection plus election. You just look at the criteria for the top echelon of Chinese leaders, say the member of political bureau of the party central committee or standing committee. In most cases, these leaders have been working on the grassroots at different levels of Chinese government hierarchy for decades. Mm-hmm. So usually they've governed more than, say, 100 million people before they come to the current position. So extremely competent, highly selective. And so I call this selection plus election. It's by far a better model than simply relying on election. We're very proud of this.